Hi, everybody. I'm Rashmi from North York Community House. I want to welcome everybody who's joining us today and taking time out of their busy days and schedules to learn about the calls to action, which are really foundational to reconciliation. We have people from everywhere, BC, Toronto, all across Canada, registered, and we really appreciate your support. I also want to thank our partners, the Neighborhood Group, and the Toronto Southwest Local Immigration Partnership for joining us today and helping us partner to support the call to action. So some of us or I have struggled with territorial land acknowledgements because they can feel performative. So today we've decided to acknowledge in a different way, and that's with gratitude. By integrating a version at the Thanksgiving address, it both acknowledges relationship and engages us in integrating a key foundation of an Indigenous worldview that is a good beginning for living well on this land that for many millennia has been and still is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, Erie, Neutral, and the Métis. Today, we've gathered and we see that cycles of life continue. We've been given the duty and responsibility to live in balance and harmony with each other and all living things. So now, we bring our minds together as one as we give our greetings and our thanks to one another as people. All our minds are one. So welcome again, and I'll pass the mic to you.
I just want to bring to everybody's attention, though, this is commitment. We are having this session from Montreal Airport. He has just landed. So this is dedication, and we can't thank you enough for being here.
Oh, well, compliments get you everywhere
I
because
know.
but I do want to apologize because I'm not dressed in a beautiful Joan shirt like I try to do everywhere that I go because Joan is my personal person who makes me look good across the country. I'm basically wearing my flight clothes, which is sponsored to you by sports companies, etc. Anyways, so normally I would come to you in my living room, and as you remember last time, we had a very nice talk or a very nice a session in which we talked about a series of calls I'm going to talk with you a little bit about for today, and then today we're going to talk about the arguably the biggest swath, the biggest theme of the calls. But while we do that, while I see a bunch of people still coming in the room here, I'm just going to let you handle all that. I'm going to pin myself, which is right there, and I think I'll start sharing my screen here. Okay, so there's that. There's my emails. And like I said, I have just landed in Montreal. I'm on my way to the Governor General Leadership Forum, which is in Quebec City. I'm just here giving a talk at Concordia University and then doing some work in Montreal tomorrow, and then probably sitting with the rest of the city. I think it's game one of the Stanley Cup, so maybe watching that, and then heading off to Quebec City. The side impact of that is my daughter is actually in Quebec City doing her Explore program. And so, as she said to me last week, no matter where I go, I can't escape you. And I said, that's welcome to life as being my daughter. And I think any parent for that matter. Today, we're going to talk about education. Now, education is the biggest swath of calls. Like it would be impossible for me to sort of describe to you like where does education begin and end when it comes to the TRC. Um, uh, uh, Shameless self-promotion yet again. That's me. That's my stuff I do. That's my book. But session two is going to talk about what is the role of education in the TRC calls to action. What we did was in the first session, we talked about child welfare, health, and justice. Now, there's a reason that I pick basically the three central most harmful institutions in the country when it comes to the legacy of residential schools, when it comes to the treatment of Indigenous peoples. In many ways, we started with child welfare, health, and justice because that's where you see the most amount of ongoing legacies of that kind of hierarchical relationship that residential schools and the Canadian education system were both built upon. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But to give you a little heads up of what we're doing in, I guess, 2 weeks, I shouldn't be in an airport for the next 2 sessions. These are this is the one, I think if you remember, I said to you, one of my sessions is going to be a little complicated. Well, this is the one. And so I will be in Winnipeg on June 3rd for the session that we will be talking about Indigenous rights. We're actually going to talk a little bit about that today, but not tons. We're going to talk a little bit about Indigenous rights when it comes to reconciliation and what we'll say calls to action 43 through 94, which are what's called the reconciliation section. And then, of course, session 4 is we're going to deal with a few specific calls to action it's going to be number 4 is going to be the potpourri of the calls, meaning I'm going to pick a few of them. We're going to analyze them, sort of see where we're at when it comes to a series of them and go from there. And that one I should be in Winnipeg, no problem. Actually, no, I will be in Toronto for that one. So I don't know, maybe we can set up where I give it live on the 17th at NYCH. It'll be great because I will be in Toronto for that day. Okay. Okay, so skill testing question as usual. One of these people in this picture is my father. See if you can figure out which one it is. Obviously, it's the guy on the right. No, the guy on the left. And Justin Trudeau is not my father. It is Murray Sinclair. Now, I'll tell you a little story. Okay. I grew up in the 1980s, 1990s, but the hinge point, of course, between both those decades, but the hinge point for me in my brain, in my growth as a person, as an Anishinaabe, an Anishinaabe person, 1990. Now, 1990 was 2 really pivotal moments in the country. One was the resistance at Oka. And for those of you that don't know about Oka, basically the town of Oka in Quebec sought to expand their golf course onto Haudenosaunee territory. That territory was lands in which ancestors were buried, ceremonies took place, very sacred territory. And so the Haudenosaunee people stood up against that. There was a big moment, a lot of TV coverage. There was on the nightly news every night, it was talking about taking lands from Indigenous peoples and what Indigenous peoples were doing in response to that. And it was really the first kind of moment, not the only moment, but the first moment in which Canadians learned that Indigenous peoples were going to resist. They were going to enact and not going to just simply have their lands be taken for something frivolous like a golf course. The second thing that happened in 1990 was there was, of course, the negotiations for Canada's constitution. At the time, an agreement had been forged at Meech Lake, and at Meech Lake, there was what's called the Meech Lake Accord. And the Meech Lake Accord was the attempt to renew Canada's constitution by bringing Quebec in. But of course, who was left out was Indigenous peoples. And in the Manitoba legislature, in my house, when I was growing up, was many Indigenous peoples. And one of them was a guy named Elijah Harper. Who at the time was an MLA for Churchill, Kiiwetinoong, Aki, I think was the name of the riding, which is in northern Manitoba. Elijah Harper was a very strong, smart, and also very connected person. My father was his former campaign manager when he was running for election for the NDP. And of course, he had many other friends, Phil Fontaine, Obi McCurdy, and a number of others, community members, partners, family members, all these different people. I can remember people talking about Elijah Harper standing up in the Manitoba legislature and refusing to ratify to allow Meech Lake to go forward. And that's what ended Meech Lake alongside some work that was being done in Newfoundland. Those two things ended the Meech Lake Accord because Indigenous peoples were not included. Now, the reason I tell you that is because that for me was a moment of learning. It was a moment of growing up. It was a moment of realizing I used to read these comic books called Justice League, and they're full of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, all these kinds of things. What I realized at that age of 14 at that time was that I couldn't just read about justice, especially about superheroes that had nothing to do with my lives. I had to stand up for justice. And I saw that my relatives, people that looked like me, were standing up for justice, but they were trying to get a country to understand that you can't just simply treat Indigenous peoples like you had in the residential school period, that you continue to during the Indian Act, and that you treat Indigenous peoples as though they have nothing to contribute, nothing that says anything, does anything, and most importantly, that Canada was started by Indigenous peoples. There is everything in Canada starts with Indigenous ideas, pedagogies, principles, practices. And I think we covered a little bit of this in the last session. Indigenous peoples are fundamentally and peoples. Like, if I were to say to you, like, what is Indigenous education? I would say it's basically the learning or the basic principle that everything that we do is related to something else, is intended for the future. I just gave a talk, was it yesterday morning, where someone asked me to explain Indigenous epistemology. And I said, it's basically built into 4 L's. And here's the 4 L's. Indigenous thought, knowledge is all about life, love, longevity. I feel like I missed an L there. I have to look up my book. But basically that everything is locality. So it starts with locality. Locality is actually the first one. So everything we need is right here. Everything is intended towards building life. Love is what connects all things. And then lastly, that our job is to think about how we're going to live tomorrow, not yesterday. So longevity. And that's Indigenous life. Everything that we do is about thinking, what is it that we're doing in this place, and how do we interact, with each other respectfully and meaningfully. And then, of course, the most important thing about all Indigenous peoples is that we have to figure out how we're going to live tomorrow. Here's a basic misunderstanding of reconciliation. A basic misunderstanding of reconciliation is that we need to find places that we agree upon. I think that's maybe part of it, a small part. It's certainly we have to figure out a way to move forward, compromise, and so on, and on everything that we do involving Indigenous peoples, Canadians, newcomers, and the fact that we're all coming together. That's not actually what reconciliation is, though. Reconciliation is disagreeing and sticking together. Because if you can't do those two things, we do disagreeing really well, but then we'll have to turn away from each other. We refuse to speak to. We say, oh, well, you don't vote like me, you don't act like me, you don't dress like me. And then we turn away, we turn into our own little corners of the universe. That's impossible in Indigenous life because we lived in lodges for 8 months at a time, shielding from the winter, and you simply can't escape when you're living in a structure with a group of people. B is that's not foundational to an interrelationship in all things, which you are constantly engaged with. And, explain to me, for example, when you stop having relationship with eagles or water or the sun or stars, like there's never a time you stop having relationships with all these things. Like they're constantly breathing the same air, they're moving in the same space, they're engaging with you at all times. And so your job is to figure out where you belong in all of that. And these are what my father often would refer to as the 4 questions, which are the things that we have most removed from Indigenous children, but we certainly have given other children, even newcomer children, the space in which they can answer those 4 questions. Those 4 questions of who am I, why am I here, who can help me, and then where am I going? All of those are and questions. How do I relate with all of these things? Like, why am I here? What is my purpose in all of these things? And that's what Indigenous education is for us. Now, another story. Way back in the 16th century, there was some men in black coats who showed up in our community. They are the original Jesuit missionaries who came and visited us as Anishinaabe in a place called Boating or Sault Ste. Marie. And when they showed up, they said, hey, listen, we want to tell you this story. It's brilliant. It's beautiful. It's about this guy. He's inspiring. He visits many places. He makes many people happy. And he does that because he tells stories and he explains to the world how we should love each other. And one of the things that he does is some pretty interesting things that almost seem like they're non-human. And here's what I mean is he can walk on water. And one day, terrible thing happened to him. He died, came back to life. We were like, that's a great story. What an interesting story that is. that actually sounds a lot like our stories. What's the name of your guy? We said to the Blackcoats. They said, Jesus. And we said, wow, our guy's name is Wînipêk. And Wînipêk does really amazing things. Sometimes can transform into a bird. Sometimes can live for a very long period of time, even beyond human life. And oftentimes teaches us about all these different beautiful parts of creation. Why the buffalo has a hump, why the stars twinkle, why the sun is so bright and vibrant every morning. And then, of course, one day he transformed into a rabbit, went and collected fire, and on his back, on his fur, carried it back to the people. Maybe your guy and our guy are cousins. Maybe they're the same guy. We don't know. Now, the Blackcoats, of course, heard that story and said, nah, our stuff is capital T truth, absolute truth, never doubt truth. And most importantly is I need you to cut your hair, burn the drums, and never, ever, ever talk about that story ever again. And Anishinaabe people were like, nah, they're cousins. They're for sure cousins. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. Sorry, but my phone just rang there. I just blacked out the screen. Everyone can still see me, I'm hoping. Can someone just nod at me and give me a thumbs up? Maggie, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me?
We can see you, Niigaan.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Sorry if it's very loud in here. So I can only control so much. So okay. And so this is where we build Indigenous education models. And of course, it's based in relationship between all things. And we often use things like trees or circles or interrelationship, the trees and the roots, thinking about all the different ways that we interact with the world. Now, of course, I know First Nations education models the best. I'm a former teacher. I now teach at the university. I do lectures across the country on concepts of Indigenous education. And the important thing to remember here is the story I just told you is our positions as Indigenous peoples, virtually every single nation, is that we are and people. It is or that was brought to us. And what I mean by that is that you cannot function in a society with or. Not if you want to stick together, not if you want to find ways of solutions and compromise, and you certainly can't live together for 8 months if you are going to be an or person. You have to be an and person, but you have to be an and person for all things. You have to realize that you are connected with all of these things. And there's been the Canadian Council of Learning basically determined that Indigenous students have two different ways that we learn. The first is what we call our home teachings. This is very much based in kind of Dad's 4 questions. This is where the 4 questions come from. We need to know, like, why are we located in this space? These are the roots of this tree. What's our community self? What's our languages? What's our traditions? Like, that's our core teachings of who we are. Those are those 4 questions that Dad spoke about. And then we can try to become our most political, economical, social, spiritual, cultural selves by reaching out to the rest of the world, interacting with people from other walks, other ways to learn, other religions, other systems, other pedagogies, but then most importantly, non-humans. You know, we become our most effective collective well-being by working with those things that are not us. And those might be, for instance, English or French people or Filipino or people from, China, people from Australia, people from New Zealand, whatever it might be. But it also might be the bears, the fish, the trees, the sun, the moon, all of these different things. But we first and foremost must figure out all of the answers of what we understand the world to be. And of course, that's an interrelationship between all things. Now, of course, the residential schools have impacted this the most. Now, I'm going to make the argument here today that residential schools did impact Indigenous peoples, absolutely, but it actually impacted Canadians far worse. And here's what I mean, is that Indigenous peoples may have experienced great trauma, harm, and sexual, physical abuse in residential schools. And I think that's well documented. But it's actually Canadians who were taught not only that treating Indigenous peoples that way was normal, but that they should do it forever. they should continue to do it always. And every textbook, every movie, every way that we interact with each other, the exact way that Ottawa operates, and the way that Queen's Park operates, the ways that the Manitoba legislature operates, that there's going to be a fundamental principle in the country, which is that Indigenous peoples don't matter and Canadians do matter. Indigenous peoples are problems, Canadians are the solution. That begins to shift in the 1960s. And what that means is that it then goes into this kind of moment of resistance. And this moment of resistance starts with residential school survivors absolutely bafflingly turning to education. They don't turn to land claims, although that's part of it. They don't turn to child welfare, although that's part of it. They turn first and foremost to taking over the schools that they had attended. And the Blue Quails Residential School is probably the best example of that. In 1969, it starts being taken over by this group of young residential school students who are now survivors. They begin to build education, and they build a kind of sense of education. And they start that kernel of what my father will eventually say, which is that education got us in this mess, education will get us out of it. And that brings me back to that story I told you just a minute ago. When I grew up in 1990, that was kind of the culmination of what was started back in the 1960s, 1970s, where Indigenous peoples had been resisting, but now suddenly it became a mainstream thing. It became something you saw on the news every night. And I remember saying to my father, just a year later, in 1991, when I was 15, I said to my father, I said, "Hey, Dad, I guess I should become a lawyer, eh? And, I should fight for our land, just like they did in Oka. I should fight for our rights like Elijah did. And I should go out and I should, make $1 million, because being a lawyer, you do all this land claims and fighting for our people." My dad said something I'll never forget, which he said, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I don't want you to become a lawyer. What I want you to do is to become a teacher. Teachers are going to save the world," he said. And I said, "Oh, is that because being a teacher, you make $1 million?" And he goes, "Yes." And I did. I made $1 million as a grade 9. No, nobody makes any money as a grade 9 teacher. You make no money at all. You're broke all the time. So, we don't treat teachers with any respect in this world, even though they do fundamentally one of the most important jobs other than parenting that is to society. Like, people don't really listen to lawyers, don't really listen to child welfare workers, don't really learn to even listen to their doctor, but they will listen to a teacher, especially if they're in a position in which they create a relationship with that teacher and they trust that teacher. Teachers don't get paid with $1 million, but they do get paid with hope. And, it's no surprise that education then forms the basis for the TRC, based in those original residential school survivors. Eventually, the resistance movement that then culminates in Oka and Elijah Harper's note. But there's a realization in Indigenous communities that law, healthcare, child welfare, none of these things will be changed without learning first, without engaging ideas, talking to each other, learning from each other. And this is where the TRC becomes really a venue for education. It's not a venue for almost anything else at the same par as it is education. Oftentimes I hear people criticize the TRC, certain academics or certain people who want to gain notoriety in some way, right wing, left wing, whatever it might be. And they'll pick apart the TRC. They'll say, "Oh, there's no mention of land in the TRC. Oh, there's no mention of reparations by Canadians, changing government, for example, or, like was with the Royal Commission talking about an Indigenous Parliament or something like that." Or people might say, "Oh, it doesn't fun. It puts all the emphasis on Indigenous peoples teaching or learning or assisting Canadians to learn." Some of those criticisms may or may not be valid. I always think that it's very convenient to throw rocks when you never went to any of the events. I also think that for certain individuals who want to build a career off of tearing things down and never build anything up, then I say that go sit in your corner in your ivory tower and just enjoy your time by yourself, because the rest of us out here are trying to figure out ways to work together. And so what the TRC did is way bigger than all of those things combined. That the TRC did is it suggested that we can't get anything done until we learn about each other, until we spend time talking, learning, telling stories. And this is where I might just bridge into a moment and say this was actually my dad's career. My dad's career, yes, was a lawyer. Yes, was advocating for rights, being a judge, those kinds of things. But in so many ways, he had came to the profound realization that it may have been his first choice of a career, which was to be a phys ed teacher when he first went to university the first time around before he became a lawyer. That might have been the place where liberation is possible. And so he, in many ways, he took education courses. He studied to become a teacher. He didn't finish that degree, but he then took all of those things and put them into law. Now, I want you to look at the TRC calls. We covered that last time, and we'll cover it every time. So I'll always pull up this slide as to what are the TRC calls and so on. Remember what I said to you before, which is that 1 through 42 are what's called legacy. Those are those calls that are institutions that are continuing, that come from the basic idea of residential schools, which is Canadians are the problem solvers, Indigenous peoples are the problem, Canadians are superior, Indigenous peoples are inferior, et cetera, et cetera. And they create those institutions, like they're the foundational basis for child welfare, education, language and culture, health and justice. And I don't have to argue very long to show you that education, even though it may be different than the residential school period, is very much still in the residue, immersed in, and is absolutely repeating the same cycles residential schools created. We just happen to have kids in the same room now instead of separate buildings. Let me give you an example. Through kindergarten through grade 8, we actually do a pretty good job of teaching young people to share, to respect one another, to learn about each other, to listen. We actually have this on our report cards. Johnny didn't punch anybody. Way to go, Susie. Listened very well. Like those kinds of things. And that's basically kindergarten to grade 8. There's a little bit of content in there, but for the most part, it's about citizenship. It's about belonging. It's about relationships. It's not about always what it is in grade 9, 10, 11, 12. For some reason, we decide at grade 8 that we're going to declare war on sharing, cooperation, and anything involving community. From grade 9, 10, 11, 12, we decide, every single thing you're going to learn from this point on is about becoming the best individual that you can, competing with everybody else, collecting the credits that matter, capitalism, and making sure that you leave everybody behind, that you only achieve by yourself, and that most importantly, that if you do that enough, if you gain all of those individual accolades and you literally step on people's heads as you go up the ladder, you'll get the Governor General Award. You'll get the big money. You'll get everybody applauding at the end. You'll get in the newspaper. Like, we live in schools that foster hate against Indigenous values, or values that are centered in Indigenous life. It's not that we don't believe in competition. It's not that we don't believe in even, gaining a little bit of wealth, or it's not even that we have hatred against, individual work and individual progress. It's that they have a foundational relationship with community, with collectivity, with the betterment of all, and most importantly, thinking about tomorrow. Those things I spoke of before: locality, life, love, and longevity. In schools, we immerse kids in a boot camp of how to create a world in which Indigenous peoples will be 100% isolated, marginalized, and anything Indigenous related, anything where Indigenous peoples are saying, hey, we should think about the eagles. Hey, we should be thinking about the person who's just shown up from this country way over here and welcome them in, give them a cup of soup. And that is the foundation of what is the country. Indigenous peoples are the inventors. I believe I said this in the last class, but I'll say it here. It is Indigenous peoples who are the inventors of all those things that are Canadian: multiculturalism, healthcare, democracy, free speech. Europeans knew nothing about those things when they arrived. They only knew the king and the pope mattered. They knew that your job was to make sure that all those non-Christians had no rights and had no land, because it was only Christians that had things. That's an or idea. And that thirdly, we had to make sure that we only collected things for ourselves. We took things from places. We never gave anything back. And that most importantly, you hoped that when you took those things and you gave them to the king, that a few pennies might roll down the trickle-down economics of the 15th century. You definitely didn't have the idea that everybody should be fed. You definitely didn't have the idea that everybody should get medicine, that everybody should have warmth. It's dog eat dog, fend for yourself. And it was Indigenous peoples who taught the newcomers that. And that's where all the things that are Canadian, where they come from. But for some reason, I'm going to call it good old Eurocentrism. There is a fundamental belief in schools that the only values that matter are those who were based in European civilizations. Indigenous peoples may have had them here and there, but absolutely could not survive the winter with those ideas of war and competing and turning away from each other. And that these were the values that Indigenous peoples held so dear, and that's therefore where we get education being a fundamental part of every single one of calls to action 43 through 94. Now, we're not going to talk too much about those calls today, because what I want to do is I want to spend time talking to you about calls to action 6 through 12, and specifically 62 and 63, because those calls arguably are the ones that will be the game changers. Those are the ones that will be the biggest steps in growth for not just Indigenous peoples, but for Canadians, because it will then allow ourselves to see things we have never seen before. Like I said, if I were to go through all the different calls and try to explain to you, like, where is education, I'll be here forever. Probably all 94 have something to do with education. Some more overtly than others. We say we train civil servants. We speak things about relationships with Indigenous peoples in the oath for citizenship, museums, things we're going to talk about in the coming sessions. And even the ones that we covered last class, the one where we say we need to train child welfare workers, train people in healthcare, train people in justice. Notice that most of those were about education. Now, as we do that, we have to realize that education will be for a bigger picture, and that will be for next session, which will be about talking about rights. Once we realize a fundamental premise, which is what I'm going to say in the next session, but I'll say it to you now, which is that Indigenous success, that means recognition of rights, recognition of land claims, the implementation of all of that recognition throughout Canadian society. Once we realize that Indigenous success will lead to the success of all citizens, like it always has been, like back in the 15th century, when Indigenous peoples had food, they could welcome in those Europeans who came from a far distance and say, sit for a while, sit by the fire, have some soup, rest for a while, and then you can be busy to start to do some of those things by building relationships and building forts and building trading posts in our territory. It's when Indigenous people succeed, everybody succeeds, because fundamentally we're working in an idea that the collectivity is the indication of our own health, our own well-being, of our own 4 questions. Canadian success almost always doesn't mean or is against or undermines Indigenous success. Like Canadian success, for the most part, for the past 150 years, when Canada builds an economy, who do they build it off of, and who do they leave in poverty and mired in struggle? When Canada goes and fights in a war overseas, where do they base their army bases and take those lands and say, oh, it's just going to be for a year, and then never give that land back? Or if they do, it's full of contaminated soil, and Indigenous peoples are then stuck with this mess they have to clean up. Here's another one. When Canadians succeed in terms of building a healthy, safe, and just society, who are the one group of people who never experienced that justice, or that justice is built off of what is the cost that Indigenous peoples have to incur? Like, for example, it's a good example. So when we say that certain ideas in healthcare, like when we say certain medicines have value, and we say we're going to focus on body, we're going to build all of these different people who are going to be all successful, especially pharmaceutical companies are going to make billions of dollars. We do this by deciding what health practices are normal, acceptable, and which ones are not normal and acceptable. And those are the ones that are always Indigenous. These are the ones that are always the ones that are about often urban, often from certain class of people that are very privileged. And most of all, it's not even often about thinking about mind, heart, and spirit, because Indigenous health is about mind, body, heart, spirit. It's usually just about the body. And that means that when we even have anything, Canadian success often comes at the cost of Indigenous peoples. And this is what I'm going to talk about when it comes to rights. When we realize that the 46 articles and calls to action 43 through 94 are game changers, they're going to create efficiency, and they're going to create a wealthy economy, and they're also going to create an economy in which not only do we have less jails, less less emergency rooms, less, like, we won't need those things. What we're going to need is we're going to need more universities, more workplaces, more innovation, more, you know, we want to be optimistic, more inventions as we create sustainable growth throughout the entire economy in perpetuity. Now, so let's look at a few of these calls to action. So see here. Now I'm just going to jump through a few of these because some of these have not actually been touched in any way. Remember what I said to you before? TRC calls, about 14 have been implemented, about 40 have some work done on it, and 40 haven't been touched at all. Most of these have been touched area, but have not been implemented. So, like for instance, call to action 6, for example. I just want to see if this legislation was officially passed, so I don't want to give you the wrong information. Yeah. So, okay. So call to action 6 basically takes up the idea that we should not give corporal punishment to young people. Now, corporal punishment is the idea of physical harm of a child for the purposes of, and I'll read it for you. For the purposes, according to the Supreme Court, the interpretation must be of the harm, the corporal punishment, like for instance, striking a child, must be transitory and trifling and intended for correction and incapable of causing future harm. Okay, so the problem is that for this call to action makes a lot of sense. It has a lot of historical precedence, and it certainly comes from the corporal punishment that occurred almost every day in residential schools. And one of the reasons that this call to action was so important for survivors was because they did not want their children exposed to these practices. And so in the Indigenous community, generally, corporal punishment is seen as a faux pas and certainly not something that is acceptable, even though it may or may not occur in homes and communities, and people may or may not be aware of that those things are occurring. A general in the Indigenous world, a feeling of removal of physical violence against children. But unfortunately, within certain interpretations of the law, that there is it's a bone of contention across the country, and certainly cases have come up. And what I was looking for is there's been legislative efforts to remove Section 43 of the Criminal Code, which allows for corporal punishment of children. But it keeps getting pushed ahead and it keeps getting modified. And oftentimes what's used is it's used for certain cultural arguments or geographical arguments or as a provincial mandate, because oftentimes child welfare is considered to be under a provincial designation. And so the argument of the provinces is that they should be able to decide this regionally, not federally. So we're not quite anywhere near there, but I think that call to action 6 has a bit of work that's been done. It's certainly a set of work that's been done in the Indigenous world, even if not officially. Call to action 7 is something that will be impossible to complete, but absolutely there have been some steps that have been made. And I want you to remember the dealing with Call to Action 7, which is to eliminate gaps between educational and employment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Now, this is a call that will never be completed because there will always be some kind of difference between Indigenous communities and Canadians. For the mere sake that there's geography, there's culture, there's language, there's long historical circumstances that have created the circumstances for each. There very likely will be an urban-rural divide for the perpetuity of our lifetime and probably forever. Urban people tend to invest in urban issues, which tend to be majority, than rural issues. And so there will always be this disparity. First Nations that are rural-based and urban communities, which are often, very privileged, have access to technology or wealth or jobs or so on. There will always be a bit of a disparity. So I would say that this gap is never going to be removed. But I want you to remember Call to Action 7 when I tell you something when it comes to talking about calls to action 11. Call to Action 11. So just keep this in the back of your head as we go here. TRC Call to Action 8 it says that we need to eliminate the discrepancy in federal education funding for First Nations children being educated on reserves. So that has never been dealt with. And not only has it not been dealt with, while there have been certain moments and certain schools that have been built, programs that have been delivered, weirdly enough, the private sector is picking up a lot of this slack. This is where you get in First Nations communities a lot of partnerships with certain companies that are seeking to create other financial beneficial means for themselves. And so, for example, Dell Computers, for example, Trans-Canada Pipeline building the school, a hockey area, arena, those kinds of things. And this is where Jordan's principle started to deal a little bit with this call. But the fact is that, if you're a First Nations kid on a reserve and you're an urban kid in a city, you still experience the fact that you are 2/3 funded versus every other child in this country. And there's been many different court cases, Cindy Blackstock's probably the most notable, who have said that because of this ongoing chronic underfunding, these gaps, you're creating situations in which children end up in the child welfare system. It's one feeds another. This is why Call to Action 9 came in. This has also never been approached and never been dealt with. We call upon the federal government to prepare and publish annual reports comparing funding for the education of First Nations children on and off reserves, as well as educational and income attainments of Aboriginal peoples in Canada compared with non-Aboriginal people. So with the federal government, this is where the federal government has said, we were doing this before the TRC. They have, for instance, a census. We know that the census is incomplete, certainly problematic, and not completed very much by First Nations. Never mind the fact that many First Nations may or may not have an address that a census arrives at. Never mind the fact that many have historical mistrust for sharing their personal information with the federal government, because the federal government in the past has tended to do things that are very violent and destructive when having access to Indigenous information. So this is a call to action. It's very, very complicated and difficult. And certainly the first half has never been touched. The annual reports comparing funding from education of First Nations children on and off reserves. But secondly, the census is not adequate for talking about educational and income attainments, but it is at the moment the only thing that we have. That's the numbers that I use when I give talks and so on. Now, here's the other two calls before we really deal with the big call, which is Call to Action 11. We've Call to Action 10 is we call upon the federal government to draft new Aboriginal education legislation with the full participation and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And then, of course, a commitment to sufficient funding. That absolutely has never come in. And part of this problem, of course, is that the federal government is always motivated by downloading education to provinces, because provinces are the ones set up best for delivering education for their citizens. The federal government actually does a very poor job running the very few federal schools that they run, or funding or overseeing them. And they often leave that to many First Nations to run, generally with almost no oversight other than financial oversight. And so there is a kind of realization or maybe an argument from the federal government that this is an impossible call to fulfill, but it is also what they feel to be counteractive to the encouragement of on reserve schools to work more effectively with provincial counterparts, which of course is a treaty violation. And that when you tell any First Nations person that they've got to go work with provinces, you're actually violating treaties with that, because our relationship was with the Crown, not with Doug Ford, or as an example. So, okay, call to action 12. This one, it depends on really geographically where you are, but it says, we call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Indigenous families. Now, this call is absolutely underway. There has been lots of work done, but predominantly by provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments, not by the federal government. Although there may be an argument to be made that some of the Section 91, Bill C-91, Indigenous languages implementation, which has often gone to after-school programming, may or may not be part of these early childhood education programs. And if you got the federal government to do a report, no doubt they would say, we have done some work on call to action 12. I'm here to tell you that the federal government has done no strategy on this. But provincial governments have had strategies with proportional Indigenous populations. In Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Northwestern Ontario, there are certain Indigenous language programs, but also Indigenous-run daycares, Indigenous-run small areas of programs that are like weekend visits for developing with Indigenous young people leadership conferences and these kinds of things. So there is some work that's been done on number 12. Now, let me take you to the big one now. Now, you'll notice that this is get its own slide. It's not bunched in with all the other slides, which, as we mentioned before, out of the 6 through 12, most of them, a little bit done, some more than others. None done at all. Another one, it would take a lot of interpretation to decide it's been done. This one is the game changer. This one is the real game changer, but it's never been implemented other than to say that, well, let's look at the word adequate here. So let's read it. Call to action 11. We call upon the federal government to provide adequate funding to end the backlog of First Nation students seeking a post-secondary education. So here's first and foremost, because of the treaties and because of the fact the Indian Act treats all First Nations people in the country as the same, whatever was negotiated in the treaties, the numbered treaties post-Confederation, becomes the kind of rule or law of the land. And that means that a treaty right that was negotiated in Treaty 1 from onwards all the way to Treaty 11 was that Indigenous students or First Nation students would have access to education. And that education at the beginning looked like residential schools, draconian, brutal institutions. But eventually, throughout the 1960s, 1970s, First Nations made the argument that it would result in not just going past residential schools, so that would be grade 6. Most ended at grade 6 or grade 9. Most ended at grade 6, actually. So anything after grade 7 through 12, that would be paid for. And what that means is that if you're a First Nations person on a reserve and you go to a city school, that city school, once finding out that you're a status Indian, this is why, by the way, they're so motivated by census, by trying to figure out if you're First Nations or not, because they can then go to the federal government and say that we've got a status Indian here. You have to pay us for their education. This is a windfall for school districts, which is driving a lot of the interest in tell us what ethnicity you are, sort of thing. Now, the reason is because education is a federal responsibility, but now First Nations have turned that around somewhat and have said that not only do we have education up to grade 12, but the treaty said we would have education in perpetuity. It's the one thing that the treaties talked about. And so therefore, that's been a successful argument for not just university, but also master's, PhD, college certificates, even whatever is approved as an educational journey leading to employment. So I've seen, for example, under federal funding for education, certain programs for nurses' aides, for example, or business development, or there's been a number of things that are all differently approved. Now, my point of it is that starting in 1992, when there was the implementation of what's called the 2% cap on all First Nations funding, which was brought in by Paul Martin, the Liberal then finance minister, soon to become prime minister. He believed that due to a funding issue that there shouldn't, up to that point, funding on First Nations had always matched inflation. So if inflation was 2, 3, 4%, that's what the funding would increase for First Nations. And arguably, if the inflation goes down, then the funding would go down. That does not happen very much, but governments tend to inflate inflation versus reduce it. But that being said, when Paul Martin put on the 2% cap, subsequent Canadian governments, including his own, including Stephen Harper, including even elements of Justin Trudeau for a period of time, capped all funding for First Nations, which would then directly impact education funding. And that led to no more computer rooms in schools. That led to no more textbooks, or a lack of textbooks. Or that also led to issues in school, on reserve schools being full of health dangers and things like that. But it also led to what was going to be a burgeoning amount of Indigenous peoples who were now finishing school for the first time and wanting to go into post-secondary to college and so on. But it became what we'll call the Hunger Games on First Nations from 1992 onwards, where First Nation students were then competing with each other because only one of them could get funding. And there would be ban lists, BAND, of community citizens, in which they would then have to compete over grades, and they would have to compete over legitimacy of programs. I remember speaking to my educational counselor and going, okay, but you're getting a PhD in English, but like, what's your job? Why should we fund you for that job? Why don't we fund this business student over here taking first year instead of you? Because we have to choose between the two. And that's precisely what I'm talking about, which is when I say that all things Indigenous are declared war upon in not just schools, but also society. Call to Action 11 while funding has been restored somewhat since the time of Justin Trudeau to provide more opportunities for students to attend university as a treaty right, as an Indigenous right, but a treaty right in particular. It's not come with adequate to be able to fill the need. It's also hasn't reduced the dog eat dog, dog's breakfast, Hunger Games version on most First Nations, which takes place. My daughter just went through it usually every June or so. Everybody fights over funding, and there's a whole lot of division that's created, who gets funded, who doesn't get funded. And then, of course, if you have struggled during a year and you fail a few courses, suddenly you're kicked off the list. Somebody else is brought on, and it creates a rancorous situation for First Nations. And because this adequate funding has resulted in a poor outcome, you are seeing some success by Indigenous students. And I want to just talk about that for a second. Now, if any of you ever hear me speak, you'll know that I say that Indigenous students are growing exponentially, or more likely to go to jail, child welfare system, to emergency rooms than we are to go to university. But something is happening right now. Canada's future population is really realizing that Indigenous young people are the fastest growing population, and the group of Canadians, that's the blue graph right here. They are the majority between the ages of 35 and 59. That's right here. That's the biggest group of Canadians. The biggest group of Indigenous peoples are young. They're between the ages of 5 and 19. And in these little red dots here, you see the presence of young Indigenous peoples more than ever. So in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Regina, all those big red dots, Edmonton, Calgary, Thunder Bay, Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, lower mainland of Vancouver, lower area of Ontario. The dots get kind of more diffuse and smaller as you go. The big dot represents a community that's approximately 1 in 5 Indigenous. Or the smaller dots, 1 in 6, 1 in 7, 1 in 8. But in some communities, like for instance, Kenora, you're looking at 1 in 3. But as you go to Toronto, you don't have a big red dot, but you have populations in which Indigenous peoples make up 1 in 15, 1 in 17, 1 in 20. But that's going to shift very quickly. It's going to start to look like Wînipêk. And this brings forward a kind of cognizance of what I'm going to call the Orange Shirt Day phenomena. Now, as Canadians are learning, they're learning about, because of the TRC calls, learning them in their workplaces, talking in their child welfare hospitals, their universities, as they're starting to talk about Indigenous peoples more and more, people are becoming cognizant and aware. And there's a Ledger poll that came out that said that last year in 2025, 50% of Canadians have an orange shirt, will go to an event. That's 20 million Canadians. That's something. There's some sort of tipping point moment where now the majority of Canadians are realizing there's something happening because they're working with these young people right here. Now, shameless self-promotion moment, not just that my book is in this slideshow, but here's my daughter right here. Some of you will hear me talking about my daughter very often, but she's a flautist. She's at the University of Ottawa. I'm actually going to go see her. She's in Quebec working on her French. I think I said that already, but these are all Indigenous young people right here. They're all doing really remarkable, interesting things. There's people training to become Indigenous midwives, people becoming traditional hunters and fishers, but for the purposes of food sovereignty, feeding their community. In both cases, they're resulting in less people ending up in the child welfare system, the healthcare system, the justice system, because of work like becoming midwives, becoming teachers, becoming lawyers, becoming doctors. And young Indigenous peoples are now becoming the largest segment of new students at federal educational institutions. Let me give you an example. So the University of Manitoba, where I teach, this year, our enrollment, 3,284 First Nations, Inuit, Métis students. That's the highest amount in history. There's no other Canadian institution that even comes close to 3,284 First Nations, Inuit, Métis students. And imagine now they're all entering 4-year programs, 5-year programs. Some of them will go on to law, some of them will go into dentistry, some of them will go into wherever they go in the world. And that's just the university. Never mind Red River College, they're up to 1,800. University of Winnipeg, 1,500, the Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, their record numbers as well. And they're 11% of the entire institution. So my point is like something is happening. And those young people are entering into places. So this is the Manitoba Indigenous Youth Achievement Award winners right here. And one of them right here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this young woman right in the middle here, she just this week graduated with her law degree at the University of Manitoba. She was the former hockey player on the University of Manitoba women's hockey team. And her name is Trishelle Bunn. And Trishelle, on this night, this was the night where all these high school students and first year, second year university students were all nominated by their professors, their teachers, to be the winners of the Manitoba Indigenous Youth Achievement Award. So Sarah won for music and other people won for science, math, those kinds of things. Trishelle won for sports. Now, she announced and she said, look at all these amazing people. Her speech kind of went like this. She said, it's amazing Indigenous young people right here. They're there because of their families. And she pointed to the back of the room over there. She said, those families over there. But she said, don't forget that these teachers are the ones who nominated them, these Canadian teachers over here. And they are the most competent teachers ever in history. They're the people who stand up for young Indigenous peoples, who encourage them. And then, of course, there's all these sponsors, all these people who presented the awards who said, we're going to sponsor this award for Indigenous young people because we realize that, it's not just about being altruistic. It's also realizing that when Great West Life or Canada Life insurance companies invested in Indigenous young people, they also may be building a future employee. They're building a relationship with that community. They're looking good in their shiny pamphlets and realizing that other Indigenous people see that and see that they're the company in which they want to invest in or work with or create an EAP program for, those kinds of things. There's a whole set of relationships. She said on that night, she said, I'm going to run for chief of my community. And then she won. She just won. So she was 21 at that time, 22. And then she eventually won. She's the youngest female chiefs ever in history. She's a lawyer who went through the University of Manitoba. She's a First Nations young woman, but then she also is now a chief, and she sits at the table with premiers, with prime ministers. She's now building the country, and that is exactly what I'm talking about. That group of young Indigenous peoples who aren't doing it on their own. They're doing it because of their work with Canadians. Now, one other note to say that, they aren't just going to university. They aren't just building relationships in areas. They're actually doing something remarkable. In 2022, at the same night, that's award night, everyone was talking about what the Winnipeg police chief had just said in Manitoba, which was that there are Indigenous women in a landfill. And they've been killed by a serial killer and who disposed of their remains disrespectfully. And they ended up in a landfill. And he said the Prairie Green landfill, the remains of these two women are over here. And what he said is that they're not worth searching for. He said it's unfeasible. And of course, he was making arguments dangerous, it's too expensive. But I guarantee to you that if that was his daughter, there'd be a search for them. There'd be a search. I guarantee if they weren't Indigenous and they were female, there would be a search for them. There would be a search. I 100%. I believe that. I know that because what these young people were talking about that night, saying that's terrible that we still continue to treat Indigenous peoples as if they don't matter. It's almost like Canadian society has been conditioned. And the Winnipeg police chief, the then premier of the province, who accepted the findings of the Winnipeg police chief, it's almost like the entire society has been educated to see that Indigenous peoples don't matter, and that's somehow going to be okay. And we're all just going to move on with that. But on this night, these young people said, we're going to do something about it. And they started to tell their friends, they started to invite their friends to say, let's participate in this provincial election in 2023, where one party supported the police chief in saying that it was unfeasible to search for those women who had been in that landfill for a long period of time. But there was another party who said, we are going to search the landfill and we may not find them, but we're going to try. The most Manitoban thing we can do, that party said with that leader, is we're going to try. We're going to try to do it. And that was this guy. And those young people joined with their friends, about 17,000 first-time voters who are First Nations, Inuit, Métis, the largest burgeoning population in Manitoba, and then about 40 to 50,000 young people who are also first-time voters, Ukrainian, German, French, English, Métis. Actually, we'll include Métis with the First Nations, Inuit, Métis young people, when I said before. But people who have long-standing relationships with not Indigenous communities, but then had come into relationship with Indigenous communities in Manitoba and become Manitobans. They voted as well. And they voted overwhelmingly that we should search for those women. That became the sole election issue. It wasn't about healthcare. It wasn't about economy. And this guy, I'm not telling you he was the greatest premier. I'm not even telling you the NDP's the best party. I'm telling you, though, that this guy found them in 3 weeks. He found those two women, found their remains. And now I can tell you that I live in a province in which Indigenous young people, Canadian young people, brought forward a vision to all of us that we can live in a society where everybody might matter. Not perfectly, certainly not in a place in which where peace and harmony and justice is every day. But on one day, at one time, in a landfill, the province found some justice, some ability to move forward. And it was brought to you by young people coming together, working together, but of course was led by a First Nations premier of a Canadian province, something that never been happened before. My daughter, if I could end off by talking about this, is now part of a revolutionary movement. She's now a flautist. She believes that she can become an Indigenous orchestra player, maybe one day, and I think about the tragic passing this past week of Chris Dirksen, who was a Cree cellist, also a Cree Mennonite cellist, somebody who came originally from Northern Alberta, lived in BC and Toronto, very tragically passed away in a car accident. Was a good friend of mine. I certainly care a lot about Chris, but Chris, the entire country mourned the loss of one of the greatest cellists this country's ever produced. And she is just like Sarah, a mentor to Sarah. She can see now Cree young people who then, another basis set of Cree young people like Sarah, who can become orchestra players and who can take Mozart, but not just bring Mozart with a kind of Cree sensibility and create traditional music for 50 people, 100 people, thousands of people, where we can see something we've never heard before, see before. These remarkable moments in which Indigenous success leads to all success. And that might just be Kanata, that might be Canada. That's what the future population is going to look like, because that's the first population of dreamers. we have a group of Canadians who now are dreaming, and they're dreaming because of two specific calls. Teachers have almost unilaterally bought into Call to Action 62. That's universities. This is how we train teachers. We have to create curriculum. We have to provide funding to post-secondary institutions. We have to give funding to Indigenous schools to utilize Indigenous knowledge and senior levels in government. And in certain places, we've seen a lot of this growth. Call to Action 62 and 63 are arguably some of the most in-process calls. They're not finished. They will never be finished. Like, at what point will we decide there's enough curriculum? Like, obviously, there will never be that time. But there is substantial work that's being done to produce competent teachers. There's for almost every Canadian institution requires knowledge in Indigenous education, particularly from Ontario east or west, and then in pockets of the Maritimes and Quebec. That means that universities have realized that Call to Action 62 2 is necessary. And also, there has been a rise of competency on those First Nation schools as well. But that's often Indigenous centered. But in the past 10 years, the Trudeau government did restore some of that funding, but then also offered up the Jordan's Principle programming to sort of bridge that gap. And so you saw a lot of Jordan's Principle. I think we talked about this last time, but that we need to provide opportunities that bring Indigenous students on par with Canadians, regardless of where you live, regardless of the culture and language that you're using, regardless of the nature of the work that you're headed off to do. And Call to Action 63 is precisely what leads us to a generation of dreamers. Call to Action 63 is something that every time I walk into a room, in a classroom, in a professional development situation, in a place from coast to coast to coast, I see this call to action being done almost daily in this country, because you'll see teachers, you'll see parents, you'll see school boards, you'll see people who are picking up this work and innovating, implementing, and certainly there's more work to do. Like, again, curriculum 63.1, 63.2 is best practices and on teaching curriculum related to residential schools and Indigenous history. 63.3, though, will never be completed because of this part, which is how do we build student capacity for intercultural understanding, empathy, and mutual respect. Like, that will never be completed. And in fact, what are we talking about there? We're talking about good citizens, competent citizens, employable citizens. 63.4 is about how do we create professional development opportunities, which is why I end up in these places. But I'm not alone. There's hundreds of people that do this work, not just at the NYCH, but also in schools that you service. You know that the work that I do in schools. So Call to Action 63 is very exciting, because what it does is it creates a kind of sense of Indigenous education being a holistic approach. And it's not just in curriculum, it's also about our relationships, the hallways, the songs we sing, the territorial acknowledgements that we give. And I'm very encouraged to see the change in your territorial acknowledgement, because those statements are meant to be personal. They're meant to be about recognizing who you've been taught not to see, but then also committing to a journey. And that's where schools are doing that work. I think that they're doing it most often nationally and returning back to that National Day. They are a very significant point of growth. We wouldn't get the Orange Shirt Day movement without schools and teachers. Remember what I told you before, is teachers can save the world, because teachers are not dealing with the precedent, the hard elements of law, or the fact that the justice system is a very binaristic black and white system. The education system is very much about just seeing each other as mattering in those public spaces. And as we see each other matter, as we see each other joining with one another, this is where I realize that it doesn't really matter how many Donald Trumps of the world that we get. It doesn't really matter how many times we have small groups of unemployed people in basements producing misinformation. Education is so diffuse now, and specifically Call to Action 62, 63, and then all the other calls that have to do with education, specifically 6 through 12, but then all the other ones we're going to talk about in session 3 and 4. It's almost it's impossible to turn the clock back now. I would say that even if you had the most draconian leader be voted in as prime minister or a premier, or there was an attempt in certainly let's all pray nothing happens in terms of conflicting with other countries like the United States, for example. But even in those cases, people would do this anyways. They might do it subversively. They might do it quietly. They might do it certainly not in a kind of overt way that the Orange Shirt Day movement is creating momentum and change. But there is too many Canadians, newcomers, who have realized that you cannot go anywhere where you do not live with, work with, be married to, be living beside an Indigenous person. And that means that we all have to live together. We have to figure each other out. But we have to most importantly commit to the things that we hear from each other, that we learn. And there's nobody been doing that more than Indigenous peoples for the past 150 years. And Canadians and newcomers are only just starting to do that. But look at how much change is created in 5 years. From what was a very small regional gathering, Phyllis Webstat, that's what the last slide, there's a picture right there. And starting to talk about orange shirts, and her moment at residential school losing that orange shirt. And it's now been created into a national movement where we don't just talk about residential schools, but we talk most importantly about how do we create these spaces tomorrow? How do we do it in all these different elements of successful in systems, programs, things that I see in schools? I'll provide this with you so that you can see some of these successful initiatives that I've seen in schools. But I just want to end off here. I know that we've got just a few minutes remaining, and I am sitting in the middle of Montreal Airport at the moment. So, but it is considerably quieter than it was a little while ago. And so I hope what that did is give you a kind of sense of where education is at when it comes to the TRC calls. Also realize that what we're trying to do here in this 4-part session, and I think I said it this last time, is almost impossible to spend all this time with each call. And when it comes to the next 2 sessions, we're only going to be dealing with a very small amount of calls from 43 through 94. Basically, next session is arguably going to be just 43, 44. And then what we'll do for the last session is I will pick about a half dozen or so, maybe 7, 8, 9 of calls that we can talk about when it comes to implementing things we've never seen before, like an Indigenous orchestra, or making crazy things like museums inclusive places, or media competency, or all these different things that we'll see, or the idea of halls of fame as recognizing that Indigenous sport and Indigenous athletes are a crucial part of the Canadian identity. That's the session 4, so I don't want to give a spoiler too much for what's coming. I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that was helpful to you, and I'm happy to converse for a bit if you want, or I don't think we did too much conversing last time, but happy to check in. Maybe I'll toss it back to either Joan or
Joan, I
who
think.
else from-
Well,
Jill, yeah.
yeah.
Well, let's check the chat because there seems to have been some activity there. People having some questions. Particularly, I'm interested in the Winnipeg Chief of Police saying more stuff. But we can deal with that later.
He then subsequently was forced out. He resigned.
Okay. All right. So that's not again, that's recently. Okay, good.
No, that was 2022.
Yeah. Okay.
And he resigned in 2023, and then was replaced and soon after that.
Okay, good.
I think Ranjit has a question.
Ranjit, you asked me something last time.
Yes. This time it's specifically about your presentation, the content, and on calls to action number 12, which is on developing culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Indigenous families. Now, I work at the neighborhood group community services, and we have 11 childcare centers up to the age of 12. So how would, primarily as a social service agency that serves.
So how would you do that?
Yeah, how would you incorporate? What are the tips that you can provide?
Okay, so 3 things. So the first method is, of course, nothing for us without us. And that's a kind of general phrase for all things Indigenous, is that if you're going to try to build a relationship with Indigenous peoples, you should first by building a relationship with Indigenous peoples. And so that means engage Indigenous peoples meaningfully, start to build that relationship, invite people to conversations, do it locally first. Remember, I told you that Indigenous peoples locality first. And so meeting with me won't do it because I don't have the connections locally, and that will start to build some of your infrastructure. And that's not a thing that happens overnight. That takes a couple years to do. It may involve some coffees, may involve a meeting or two, but if you're lucky, you'll see that Indigenous peoples most oftentimes want to help you, want to support you, and as long as you treat them with respect and dignity and listen, and because if you invite people in and you don't take their advice, then they're not going to come back to the next meeting. So that leads to the second thing. And so the first one is nothing for us without us. Second is that what you'll start to notice is that your everyday business is starting to shift and change. Your routines are changing because everything, as I mentioned before, Indigenous is going to then challenge some of the things that you are doing as your everyday business. Like, for instance, you're probably saying to yourself, well, the first thing Indigenous people are going to say is the earth is our teacher. And that means now we have to go to the earth. But schools, daycares, public schools, private schools, like they're all based in ideas of isolating children from the land, keeping them as far from the land as possible. Or if we put them on there, we put them onto big metal playground thingies. But like that's not on the land learning. And so that's not the earth is our mother. And so what you do is you start to listen and work, and you'll start to realize that your business needs to change a little bit. And you have to be prepared for that. You have to be realize that you will have to do things differently. But when you're working in kindergarten, daycare, lower grades, you're going to find that this is actually going to be something very exciting. And maybe you're already doing some of those things because you are working in citizenship and community. And it may just be a few tweaks or changes here and there. But it would probably not be a wholesale change like it would be in grade 9, in grade 10. Like imagine if you said to a grade 9 class, okay, everybody, we're in biology, which I know you've been sitting every day for 199 days, dissecting an animal or something like that occasionally. But our job now is to go outside and spend time with the tree, think about the tree, and study the tree. And the first thing we'd be like, well, where's the permission slips? Where's our liability? And are we just going to do that once? Are we going to do that every day? Like, does that mean classes outside? And when you take kids outside because they're so infrequently there, they find it very hard to concentrate because they've never been conditioned to work in an environment other than that's in a concrete box, sitting in a very static, sterile desk, and then having the creativity beaten out of them, or the relationship with all things beaten out of them. And when I mean beaten, I mean like, ideologically. So here's the third thing is what you're going to start is once you start to do this work, you bring in parents, you bring in advisors, community, and then you start to change your business. Things will start to change very quickly, and it will start to feel very uncomfortable, sometimes scary, sometimes turbulent, and it will create some change. Some people around you may be uncomfortable. Some people may be very excited. They may want that change to happen very quickly. Sometimes it will, but sometimes it will create conflict, and that's why you got to stick at it. Keep at it. And so there's lots of models you can use and then adapt and adopt, that you could look up today, different ways that different daycare facilities, early childhood facilities have implemented Indigenous education. I'm thinking about I'm thinking about all the elementary schools in Wînipêk that have, reconciliation gardens. I'm thinking about all the different elders and residents programs that there are. I'm thinking about all the programs where Indigenous kids and Canadian kids work together, sometimes reading each other books. You invite kids from this institution to come spend time with kids from this school. They're reading books to each other. Sometimes they're writing letters to each other. Sometimes they're doing projects together. Like I'm thinking about all that stuff. I'm also thinking about the implementation of books, materials, YouTube videos, bringing all of those things in, and all of that is fair game and useful for when it comes to implementing Indigenous education. And remember, just always remember the 4 L's. So locality, so this place first. Everything is building towards a sense of life and love, and that love is about what we're trying to build here, but not romantic love. I'm talking about love as duty. kind of like we're showing love to the eagles by not pouring coke onto the earth or throwing garbage out our window or destroying their wetlands where they hunt and they fish, like that's the kind of love that I'm talking about, a love of responsibility. And then lastly is thinking about the fact that we're all going to live together tomorrow. And for Indigenous peoples, there's going to be more Indigenous peoples. There's going to be Canadians tomorrow. Not the majority, but every Canadian is going to eventually be working with, living beside, or be married to, or work with an Indigenous person. And that means this is an employability issue. This is not a woke DEI or guilt issue. This is a employability issue and creating a better Kanata issue. Okay. And Ranjeff, that's your second question. You're the number one question asker.
I didn't know we had a competition.
Well, he's my favorite by far. You've now superseded Joan.
Oh, come
amongst
on.
all my
Okay, so
as if that would ever happen.
do you want me to ask a question? Well, we didn't cover this one, but I just wanted to point out that it does seem to be some of the implementation of these calls to action allows the government to recolonize us in certain ways, like I'm talking about like 15 really. So
15
the language
we covered
commission
that one today. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, because that language and culture I don't spend a lot of time talking about because I'm trying to so much but like, okay, I'll give you an example. One in the education realm that is potentially harmful is when the federal government is trying to reduce employment gaps. And one of the ways that was called action, what was it, 8 or 9 or whatever it was. One of the things that they most often use is they use resource projects in which to do that. And resource projects like pipelines, mines, hydro dams, while bringing employment, but not often good employment. We're talking like oftentimes not high skill positions, high paying positions. We're talking like turning on and off the water or cleaning the building or being the local person who, like these high skill positions, often white collar positions, like you don't get to be the CEO, you don't get to be the vice president, but you do get to be the janitor and you get to be the and so, the employment's not always so great when it comes to the employment gaps. But then secondly is the cost benefit analysis to what is the destruction of other elements which require then therefore education gaps to be addressed, created from addressing the employment gap is actually sometimes self-defeating. Like, for instance, if we have a man camp, which is created for building a pipeline, you've now well documented created trauma for women and men in that community because that community doesn't come with safeguards. But you are getting people to clean that camp, and they're custodians, they're people who helped set it up, or people who maybe worked in the band office who are administering elements of that. So yeah, there's some employment that's been created from that resource project, resulting in that worker camp. But the result is that we all now have to learn about trauma. We have to learn about sexual violence. We all have to learn about, and that of course impacts graduation rates. That impacts kids that go to school. That impacts the notions of safety in the community. Like there's a whole bunch of different things. So like employment gaps, when addressing employment gaps, they don't often think in terms of how it's self-defeating, maybe with education gaps. I saw somebody have a quick hand up there. I'll take that as the final question, and then I'm going to have to head over to my I'm actually doing CBC tonight, everybody. You guys are on my CBC rotation. So today I do Power and Politics live from Montreal studio. We're going to be talking about probably pipelines, Daniel Smith and pipelines and BC. We're probably going to talk about David Eby, Premier of BC, calling Daniel Smith a separatist premier. That's his words, not mine. So, was there a question there? Saw a quick hand.
Yeah, I think Empress, you can just unmute yourself. Sorry, I think you're still on mute. Oh, oops.
Oh, you have to unmute yourself, Empress.
All right.
There you go. Okay.
Sorry about that. This question might not completely be related to what you've talked about. It's just about a client of mine who is an Indigenous person. He currently has arthritis and he can't move and was looking for support to get a scooter. However, he got referral by his medical practitioner to an OT who came in to complete an assessment. However, he was denied that. But this man is in serious pain, can really have, he's unable to go out and get things done. And I was just trying to see if there are resources out there that can help him.
Yeah. Is he a status Indian? Like he has a status card? Does he have a status number?
That I don't know. I could ask him.
Okay, well, that would be the only way that. So that should be your first question: is are you a status Indian? And because when the difference between having a status card and meaning you have treaty rights to health opens up an entire what's called the Indian Health Branch, and that's what pays for elements of your medical costs, which are outside the provincial system of health. Now, so that's your first question. And if he says no, then certain Métis locals do have certain healthcare plans that people may or may not be paying into. And so, like for instance, the Manitoba Métis Federation has a healthcare facility which helps Métis people who are their members, but you have to be in Manitoba and Wînipêk to access those services. They're not going to come to Ontario to provide that for somebody out there. So, let's pretend that he is a status Indian. So if he's a status Indian, that means that you would then contact the Indian Health Branch, or he would have to do that. He would have to make a phone call, and then he'd need a prescription for his physical therapy, and or he would need some kind of diagnosis that can enable a certain sort of things to kick in. And that might be, for instance, certain pharmaceuticals. Now, remember what I said to you before, which is that remember how students are put into the Hunger Games, and they're fighting with each other over getting into those very small amount of university spaces. But yet Canadians always occupy the land, and they're not giving up anything. They're benefiting 100% from the treaties. So really, Canadians are getting the free ride, and First Nation students are having to fight with each other for a couple university spots. Like, I would love to see Canadians fight over a few plots of land, and for First Nations to be adequately provided for in treaty. And just in education alone, like see how Canadians feel when they have to fight with each other over it, and then all the rancorous development. But that also happens in health. And so what happens in health is every year the federal government salts away what's called Indian health benefits, status Indian health benefits. So, for example, it used to be that you could get a pair of glasses back in the 1980s, 1990s. Now the federal government no longer does that. Now they'll only provide a stipend for $200 once every 2 years or a pair of glasses. And if anybody buys a pair of glasses, glasses are like $400 now, right? And so you're only getting your glasses half paid for. And if you're a person on the streets, if you're a person chronically unemployed, you've been marginalized, you're probably not getting a pair of glasses. And if you do break those glasses, you're not getting them replaced within 2 years. And so, that gap continues, the gap grows. Same thing with pharmaceuticals. So you often get only certain pharmaceuticals that are provided for, and only the bare minimum, and often generic brands. And so these are not things that are like, for instance, if you need a prosthetic, let's say you need a prosthetic leg, you're not getting the high quality prosthetic leg, which will enable your ankle to move for you to walk properly and all those kind of things. You're getting the basic bare bones, no name brand of prosthetic leg, which is the one that will probably frequently break on you, will not be suitable and fit you properly. And on top of that will be, probably create as much drama and headaches and pain as it would be for solutions. I feel sad ending on such a dark note here, but the salting away and the removal of Indian health benefits is something that affects me too. So for example, when I had certain medications that were covered for my health and mental health. And what's the biggest issue with Indigenous peoples is mental health. So it used to be that they would cover a portion of therapy sessions in relation to, like, for instance, if you're an Indigenous person and you've grew up in an environment in which some things happen that were very complicated, that might be physical sexual abuse, might also be just racism, might also be living in an environment that's been chronically damaged due to colonialism, language, culture, tradition, whatever it might be. You need your mental health just to become on the same par with other Canadians. Back when I was young, they used to cover those things in perpetuity, as long as you had a reasonable growth that your psychologist, that your certified mental health person would then fill in a form and say they need a series of another 12 sessions, whatever it might be. Now you're only allowed 4. Like, apparently you have to deal with all of your trauma from colonialism in 4 sessions. And if you there is a kind of secret way to get around that, and if you want me to whisper it in your ear, I can. It's you just leave your 4th session and then suddenly have your practitioner say that you've got a different problem, and you get another 4 sessions. And you could do that in perpetuity, but then, like, what's technically happening is you're lying, and you're having to pull the rug over the eyes of the government in order for you to get your, like, it's BS, it's nonsense, and it's certainly not based in the idea that Canadians have benefited immensely from treaties. Every single Canadian is living in a beautiful house, or driving beautiful streets, or living in a world in which you've got a military, you've got citizenship, you've got wealth beyond your means. And Indigenous peoples, all they need is like a pair of glasses. They won't even pay for that. And like, the land is not, the land is increasing in value, but treaty rights are being salted away. Like, you tell me how that's working out. Who's getting the free ride here? So, what a dark moment I ended on. Okay, here's what we're gonna end up on a positive note. Here's the positive note. I'm gonna see you in 2 weeks. We're gonna talk about Indigenous rights, which probably, and I'm gonna be honest with you, probably the most boring out of all the sessions, unless you're a legal nerd like me. Because we're going to talk about intellectual property. We're going to talk about the rights to parent your children. We're going to talk about those things. They aren't exactly the most thrilling and exciting things, but they are the game changer. And because we now have a law, both federally and then one provincially in BC, that we've got some very interesting conversations that are taking place. And a country that has never brought Indigenous rights into a conversation is now doing it on a Thursday. And like, it's coming up with weird situations. And so we're going to have a bit of fun, because I'm going to show you some weird situations that's been created. And the weirdest situation is actually in British Columbia right now, where the first second that Indigenous rights became inconvenient, the premier went, "Well, let's just cancel it then. Let's just cancel Indigenous rights then." And of course, that didn't happen. It was a big conflict, and it's still conflicting right now. And arguably, this Alberta pipeline situation will probably come right in the middle of it. But okay, so I'll hand it back to whoever. I think we lost Joan there for a second.
If you're concerned that you're ending on a negative note, don't be too upset about that. Empress, if you want to email me afterwards, I have a whole list of resources that I can send you. There's all kinds of organizations around town. And one of the things that they do is they combine special services and special things with the City of Toronto now. So sometimes you can combine that funding, right? So, but it, as Niigaan says, it's all dependent on whether or not that person has a status card. So that would be the first thing. So we'll get that person mobile sooner or later. I just want to thank everybody for being here today. It's been fantastic as usual. And I want to thank our fearless leader for rushing off the plane and finding a spot. I don't know how you do this. We've seen you in some pretty bizarre spots now. But yeah, it's fantastic. I really appreciate it. And we'll see everybody next time. Have a great afternoon.
Miigwech, everybody. Thanks so much. And we'll have the recording for you. Miigwech. Take care.
Bye.